Do you think this is going to wash with the public?
I don't care. To be honest, they've got 5 years, and it was very clear in the manifesto. No
The
new tax
public
on.
might care. The public
No,
might
no,
care. They
well,
might
they
feel
might do,
like
but in
the
the sense that
manifesto
they
wasn't
might do.
so
Yes.
upfront. Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. I'm Kate Andrews, the Spectator's economics editor, and I'm joined today by Paul Mason, journalist and columnist for The New European. Paul, great to have you here on Spectator TV. So we're less than a fortnight away from the budget now. How do you think that budget process is going?
Well, I don't have any specific inside knowledge, but it's true to say that Rachel Reeves, in her May's lecture, which seems a long time ago now, no, but it was only March this year, made two pledges. And these are not about spending, but they're about the way you do the budget. One was to ask the OBR to calculate the impact of investment on growth. And indeed, it's done it. It produced a paper saying investment can raise long-term growth quite significantly. She also said that she would be reporting on the way assets and liabilities are balanced out inside the national accounts. Now, the significance of that, known to us nerds in economics, is, of course, it signaled a move towards balancing out net assets and net liabilities in a different way and a more expansive way that might allow you to borrow more. So I think it's been fairly heavily signaled that they're going to raise employer national insurance. It's been fairly heavily signaled that most departments are looking at a kind of cash freeze or a 1%, the already scheduled 1% sort of inflationary budget growth. But I think given the sums that are being thrown around, a potential 40 billion extra in tax rises and borrowing, I would expect her to do some investment. She's going to have to, because she knows it's ABC of Rachel Reeves ism, is that if you're not gonna do everything through borrowing, taxing, and spending, then you have to do quite a bit of it through altering the supply side. She calls it the new supply side economics, and so she's going to have to alter the supply side. And that means signaling very early when you do have a bit of money to invest and spend what you're going to do it on. So personally, I hope there'll be a big wodge for defence. I think we are in a very dangerous world already, and 2.5% is not enough. I don't know whether that'll come in the first budget. They might wait until after the strategic defence review to go to the next level on defence. But I would say the number one thing is she's got to deliver some investment.
It's always interesting to go back to the Mace lectures, especially when shadow chancellors and chancellors get to give them, because we do learn a lot about the way that they think. But it's also interesting to go back to Labour's election manifesto, which was published not so long ago. You talk there, Paul, about hints in her Mace lecture that she did want to borrow more money, but in the manifesto, Labour did very clearly commit to the Tories' fiscal rules. Now it seems like they're going to try to say they're still committed with a few small minor tweaks, which will not be minor. They'll potentially allow the Chancellor to borrow tens of billions more pounds. Similar to national insurance, as you just said, people remember the tax triple lock that Labour pledged, and now they're saying, almost in a loophole kind of way, oh, we were talking about working people, we're going to lift employer NI, not employee NI. Do you think this is going to wash with the public?
I don't care. To be honest, they've got 5 years, and it was very clear in the manifesto. No
The
new tax
public
on.
might care. The public
No,
might
no,
care. They
well,
might
they
feel
might do,
like
but in
the
the sense that
manifesto
they might
wasn't
do.
so upfront.
It was very clear in the manifesto. No new taxes on working people. So employers in Labour speak are not working people. They work at the employment. They're not workers. And so an NI tax raise, a capital gain tax raise, corporation tax. I hope she could do something on that. I am not opposed in principle to raising taxes. What I do agree with Rachel Reeves on is that that's not the way to do it. That you've got to do the heavy lifting through a mixture of borrowing to invest and altering the dynamics of the supply side by regulatory changes. Probably just as big an issue is, for example, giving permission to an energy from waste plant in leafy Dorset is probably a bigger thing for shaping the future growth expectations of the private sector in Britain than anything she does in the budget. And yet no one's talking about the fact that Labour look like they're unlocking a solar power revolution, being very permissive on energy from waste. All that is what the private sector wants to hear.
I want to come back to the point about investment and borrowing, and we will, but quickly on this point about employer national insurance. It's certainly disputed what you say there, that employers aren't workers or that it doesn't affect workers. Indeed, there's a lot of evidence to suggest that when you hike corporation tax, when you hike employer national insurance, that eventually, maybe not right away, but eventually that does translate to an impact on workers' wages. And it's not just people on the right who want lower taxes that say this. If you look at evidence from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, who certainly gave the Tories a hard time over their budgets, they've been quite clear about some of these effects too. Are people, I kind of go back to that original question, are people going to buy the idea that this is really a budget for workers when you have huge tax lifts, some of which they do suspect eventually are going to end up hitting their pay packs?
I mean, I've been engaged with this argument, and it is, I'm sorry, you might say it's the IFS buy into it as well. It's a centrist, it's a sort of neoliberal argument. The idea that if you raise taxes on employers, 100% of that tax always ends up in coming out of the workers'
Well, no one said 100%. No one said 100%.
No,
but what if it's 25%? That's not insignificant.
If 25% of it, what we would say in the labour movement, and the clue is in the title, is that that's a matter for the class struggle. That's a matter for the struggle between bosses and workers in individual sectors. Quite a lot of it will be the public sector. So automatically, you've got the public sector could quite easily decide not to pass its NI raise on through trying to lower wages.
Well, then where will they find the money? Through budget cuts for public services?
This is the point. This is the brilliance of having a large public sector, isn't it? When you grow the public sector, you get tax back from it. But where will employers find the money? Well, look, this is the fundamental thing. There is a balance between profit and wages. We in the economics profession, know that there are wages and there are profits. There is capital and there is labor. And the allocation of who takes the pain is the subject of a struggle between them. And we didn't invent this. It's invented 250 years ago in the kind of era of Adam Smith. So, but if you structure the economy in a way that allows workers to defend their wages, when employers try to pass on tax rises to them, then you give it a better chance that not 100%, not 25%, but 0% gets passed on.
It'd be quite an irony if an employer NI hike from Labour saw more strikes come about when, of course, they've been trying to avoid strikes by granting those public sector pay raises. Well, let me put this to you, Paul. This process hasn't been as easy as perhaps some expected it might be. In fact, it's become quite messy. It's clear now that the Office for Budget Responsibility, which Labour has empowered, has come back and suggested to Rachel Reeves that some of the tax hikes that she thought might get a couple £billion actually may result in a couple £100 million, or indeed no money at all. And it seems like we might be looking at the worst of all worlds here, where Labour ruled out the main levers one might pull to raise significant revenue: income tax, national insurance, VAT. We're now in a world where a lot of taxes might get hiked that aren't going to raise an incredible amount of revenue when you look at the grand scheme of the budget. So it gets quite fiddly, it gets more complex. Labour also is looking down the barrel of potentially having to break a manifesto pledge. And in addition to that, Rachel Reeves is going to be borrowing more, and she's going to have to be very careful about that tightrope walk when it comes to the markets. This is not ideally how one would set out to do their first budget, is it?
Sorry to interrupt the show, but if you enjoy what we do here at Spectator TV, then why not subscribe to the magazine as well? If you subscribe today, you get 12 weeks for just £12, plus a free £20 John Lewis and Waitrose gift card. You can sign up at spectator.co.uk/TV offer.
No, and if you've got 22 billion recurring black hole in the public finances, which are the subject of an official inquiry into basically malfeasance in government, then there's not much you can do about that. We're going to have to wait to see what the OBR says about whether or not it was duped by the outgoing Chancellor. But you can only play the ball that's bowled at you. And I think that where I agree with Rachel Reeves is that the level of debt, or the absolute sum, the nominal sum of debt, is not a great 2 trillion is not a great amount is not an ideal amount to be taken into the next 5 years. If she can prove to the OBR If the OBR's methodology can evolve under the impact of its own research, so that it says, actually, do you know what? We think over 5 years, you're beginning to see quite significant growth impacts from a long-term permanent increase in public investment alongside private investment, which is crowded in, then despite the fact that you're hiking borrowing, the borrowing as a percentage of GDP can look like it's falling. And I don't think they need to or should tweak or change any of the fiscal rules that they announced before they started. They should stick to them rigorously, because we don't want to get into another situation like the Liz Truss era. So I think that's not my worry. What I say to Labour politicians when they bother to talk to me is, all right, if you don't want to do it through high taxation, you've ruled that out, fine. You have to be radical in the supply side. You have to be radical in the way you restructure the economy to start growing. And my frustrations don't lie in this direction that Rupert Harrison's talking about on the front page of your magazine this week. They don't lie in that direction. My frustrations lie in the slowness of the regulatory change that we're seeing. It needs to be faster, more decisive. The signalling needs to be decisive. A green paper on industrial strategy. I want a white paper. I want a report. I want an industrial strategy committee tomorrow, because that's the only way you can grow if you're not going to do it through tax and spend.
I think one of the points that Rupert Harrison makes quite well on the front cover of The Spectator this week is the role of the Office for Budget Responsibility. That whilst it had bad news to tell Liz Truss, well, it actually never got the opportunity to tell Liz Truss that news because they weren't aware of what was going to be in the mini budget. But when everything came round and Jeremy Hunt comes in as Chancellor, the OBR has some really bad news to dish out, but it's also had bad news to dish out to the Labour Party too. And you talk about that £22 billion black hole that Rachel Reeves keeps referring to, that has been contested, not least because the Treasury won't reveal most of the details about where the reserve money has supposedly been spent. There are outstanding questions about it, as you say. There are investigations into this. But it's very hard to pretend that nobody knew what was coming in this Parliament. It was very clear from previous assessments from the Office for Budget Responsibility that there was something between a 20 to 25 billion pound black hole in the public finances if you were going to keep departmental spending in line with inflation. The Tories knew it, Labour knew it, everybody knew it going into the election. Nobody wanted to talk about it. But the idea that it's a surprise, I don't, that's not quite right, is it?
It's the in-year overspend that's a surprise.
And we don't have the details about that.
Well, I spoke to a minister, on the conditions of confidentiality from a fairly substantial department, and they were just saying it's just unbelievable the level or the number of unexploded bombs we've found inside the actual. It's the day-to-day finances. Now, I think Labour's instinct there is to not roll that over. Civil servants are quite good at offering ministers a way of hiding or delaying the actual let's not reveal, minister, that we're actually overspent by this amount. We can do something with that. And I think Labour's instinct is, come on, let's get it on the table. And be honest about where we are. I agree with you that it was obvious that there was an under budgeting for departmental spend. That's obvious. But Reeves claims that the 22 billion is additional to that. And I think I would like to see chapter and verse on that, if necessary in this budget, if not in the budget, even before. I think the headlines on budget day can't be, I've discovered another huge anomaly. They've got to get all that out. But I think that I think those who are going to be critical of the Labour government have got to understand, at the very least, start from what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is to avoid a huge Keynesian stimulus by doing the heavy lifting through regulatory change. And that's very hard to do. It's non-spectacular. And like I say, it's about allowing a solar farm here where it wasn't allowed before, allowing an energy plant here where it wasn't before, but they need to get on with that.
Well, Labour's talk on planning reform is very encouraging and is no doubt a huge piece of the puzzle when it comes to securing long-term higher economic growth. But I'd like to know what you make of some of the spending cuts that might be coming down the line. Of course, in addition to these other promises and pledges, Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer made very clear that there was going to be no return to austerity. Now, I would note that tax hikes are a form of austerity and those are coming. But it was quite clear Labour was talking about spending cuts when they meant that. But, there are reports this week that there's going to be a £3 billion cut to welfare benefits in terms of long-term sickness spending. There seems to be some spats happening within cabinet right now with certain departments, including Angela Rayner's department, are looking to invest more money in social housing, and they are reportedly being told no, there just isn't going to be the money for that right now. Do you think another round of austerity is coming?
I hope not, and I think it would be illogical. If we say, I agree with you, by the way, that significant tax hikes reduce demand. For me, austerity is whether there's austerity and there's stimulus. And you can stimulate through tax cuts, you can stimulate through spending, and you can do austerity through tax rises, and you can do austerity through spending cuts. Okay, so if we define it like that, Rachel Reeves knows because. And Rupert Harrison is well aware of this, your front cover author this week, that austerity is self-reinforcing. The start of the 2010s decade, they miscalculated so badly that they just had to keep doing more austerity because of the negative growth effects of the existing austerity. That's what she needs to avoid and escape. I'm not hearing in Labour land a load of complaints. I think the two that were mentioned were transport and DCLG, and I need to see what that comes to. If they know, you see, what they can't do. The public services are so heavily dependent on labour, so heavily dependent on workers and skills. They can't. There's not a lot you can do. You can't say let's build 40 hospitals. So I think they've got to have to show to the OBR that the growth impact of what they're investing in now will have a long-term payoff. I mean, personally, I'd like to see some of that going to either Northern Powerhouse Rail or a revived HS2. I'm a big believer in the fact that I think if I wanted to go into the OBR and show them how investment stimulates growth, I'd go in with a housing program and a rail program, because you can point across the world that stimulates growth and therefore lessens the debt to GDP ratio over the long term. So I think they're going to have to come up with some infrastructure. And as I say, I just think defense is infrastructure. Defense, what people say, defense, there's a kind of view in the Treasury that defense is like luxury spending. It's like owning a yacht. It's not really, because if you calculate what the cost would be of having to deal with a shooting war against a peer competitor, that's going to be a lot more than anything you can imagine having to borrow and spend to get our defenses up. So I hope that will be, and of course the no-brainer. They've got to sort the prisons out. The prison system is going to have to be again pretty radically expanded. And therefore, that means building prisons in places where people don't want them, but someone is going to have them.
Paul, the last question I want to ask you is about borrowing and the word that you keep bringing up, investment. I think there is growing consensus on the left and the right that investment is desperately needed. One of the huge issues plaguing the UK is that capital spend for decades now, under Labour governments and Tory governments, has been tossed to the side in favour of day-to-day spending. And we can't be surprised, because when elections come round, the public wants to hear that there's going to be more money for the NHS, more money for day-to-day public services. Capital investment is always rated in order to pay for that day-to-day spending. So there does seem to be growing consensus that it would be reasonable for the Chancellor to do something to allow for more capital spend in her budget. But there are several issues here still, right? And I'm sorry to say to our watchers that we are back to watching the gilt market, because if you look at what's been happening over the past month to gilt yields, since there has been speculation that Rachel Reeves might borrow more, we have seen them rising. It's not catastrophic stuff, and there's a big difference between what Rachel Reeves is doing and what happened under Liz Truss. Clearly, the Treasury is preparing the markets for changes that might come. That's quite necessary. But the markets are still going to have to be convinced that these are good projects that she wants to spend money on, and in your words, that long-term payoff will be there. are. It's still got to be a convincing plan to borrow and a convincing plan to invest. And that is still risky, isn't it? Because if markets aren't convinced, that's when things start going in quite a worrying direction.
It is. But one of the reasons I was so surprised by the sell-off and indeed the panic during the 49-day Liz Truss fiasco was that during 2008, I was, one of the correspondents covering the bond market aftermath of the reaction to the Lehman Brothers collapse, and we were surrounded by people say, the bond market vigilantes, and I was talking to people in the bond market then, and they were convinced there was two schools. One said, there could be a bond market reaction, and others inside the bond market were saying continually, no, actually the central bank looks competent. The central bank looks like it's got its handle on how to handle this, and the government also does. So, so in the end, there was no huge bond market reaction to Lehman Brothers. Okay, but there was to Truss, which the lesson of that for me is that if the bond markets are convinced that there is a coherent story and intent, and that there's not messing around with the institutions of scrutiny, the worst thing to do would be to mess around with the OBR in any way, or with the Bank of England. But as long as the bond market's convinced there, I think they are happy. And we haven't talked about it, but of course, inflation is now 1.7%. And there's some interesting research flying around in policy circles that coming out of the MBER in America about how unpopular inflation has been in Biden's America, despite the fact that it was a fiscal stimulus. And what I think Labour politicians might be, and probably should be, taking away from that is you can do a lot in terms of economic happiness with low inflation. If the central bank is proving it's meeting its inflation target and in fact undershooting it, a lot of the angst of the last 2 or 3 years goes away. Because remember, the Liz Truss debacle occurred not just at a period when yields are about 4% and above, but inflation itself was huge, and therefore managing it down was almost impossible.
And interest rates were just really starting to spike worldwide when she decided to announce that mini budget. The circumstances were very different.
There's clever ways of calculating the debt to GDP ratio. There's clever ways of calculating the long-term impact of growth. But the one the OBR itself has flagged in its own academic research is to look at so you can talk about public debt with and without the Bank of England. I'm not so interested in that. I'm interested in the pure economic argument that long-term investment permanently increases the output capacity of the UK economy.
But Paul,
that's
you
in
must
an OBR
admit,
paper, and I would love to see that go into policy next week.
and you must admit that even though you can calculate these things in lots of clever ways, perhaps to find yourself additional extra billions, debt servicing payments in the UK last year cost double the defence budget. This is a very expensive game, borrowing at the moment.
That is non-ideal. That is absolutely non-ideal.
So to borrow more, it continues to be quite a risky game.
It does. And you are, whether or not the GDP ratio debt to GDP ratio is within 100% or not, the fact is that the markets always move from quantity to quality quite quickly. They snap. You know what I mean? There is probably an implicit figure out there in the bond market. I was at a bond market conference a few weeks before the election where a fairly major person in that market said to me, maybe it's around 110% of GDP for the UK. We know it's not. We know 150 is all right for Italy. We know that 250 is all right for Japan, but probably you want to keep it on the low side for the UK, given our peculiar character. But yeah, debt servicing costs are large and growing, and again, maybe not in this budget, but you want to. And I know that Osborne looked at this, didn't he, at one point, looking at very, very long-dated gilts as a potential extra arrow in your quiver would be something that I would look at.
And it's good that you brought up that low inflation rate, Paul, because this is another way in which the economic news really has shifted. And there is good news for Labour when you dig into it. It's about making the most of it. And we will find out what exactly is in that budget in less than a fortnight. Paul, thanks for joining me.